Hi, I'm Lindsay.
And I'm Marshall, and we are the co-hosts of the Tumble Science Podcast for Kids. This is Tumble's Halloween Science Extravaganza, brought to you by NEPM. For the next hour, we're going to be sharing some of our favorite Tumble Halloween-themed episodes.
We'll be exploring the science of animal mummies, investigating the case of a jack-o'-lantern gone bad, and unlocking the secrets behind a candy dagger. And we'll warn you, you might find yourself learning something new, even if you're not a kid anymore.
Before we get started, maybe we should tell people a little bit more about why we've taken over the Halloween Eve airwaves.
Tumble is a podcast that explores stories of science discovery that's appropriate for the whole family. We talk to scientists about real research and weave it together into a story with lots of humor and original music. The show is really about how science works.
We got more than 120 episodes, which you can listen to for free wherever you get your podcasts. For the past few years, every year we've done a Halloween science-themed episode.
And this is our first Halloween living in Greenfield, where we make our show and, of course, listen to NEPM.
And so they invited us to do this spooky science special.
So let's get started with this year's new Halloween episode, The Tomb of the Animal Mummies.
Let's hear it.
Hi, I'm Lindsay.
And I'm Marshall. Welcome to Tumble, the show where we explore stories of science discovery.
We're going on a special Halloween science journey today to ancient Egypt.
Oh my gosh, we're going to be talking about mummies, aren't we? That's amazing.
Yes, we are, but not just any mummies. Did you know that the ancient Egyptians mummified millions of animals?
That's a lot of animals.
So join us as we climb into ancient tombs with an Egyptologist to discover the secrets of animal mummies. A quick warning before listening, we will be talking about dead animals in this episode, and some of the science gets a bit gross.
If that's not for you, then check out one of our past Halloween episodes. Otherwise, let's get ready to explore the ancient world of animal mummies.
Salima Ikram has studied ancient Egypt for decades, and she still loves it.
I still have to pinch myself. You just think, oh my God, we're crawling into a tomb, and suddenly I think, I'm crawling into a tomb, and this is so much fun. And look, I'm going to find a mummy now.
Wait, so she's finding a mummy, right now? I guess that never gets old.
It's definitely not just another day at the office. Salima told me what it's like to excavate a tomb.
When one goes into a tomb, the first thing that one's really worried about, and I always throw a stone in first, is that I don't want to disturb any snakes or scorpions.
Yeah, throwing a stone in sounds like a great idea to me. You want to disturb the snakes and scorpions first.
After the coast is clear, it's time to have a look around. Salima told me about one excavation she was on when she had to climb down a ladder into a very narrow chamber that had never before been opened. With one look inside, Salima could see that it was filled with mummies.
And then I wound up wiggling inside a chamber that was about, 3 feet high, but 2 feet were filled with mummies.
Wow, so she was the first person inside this mummy chamber for thousands of years.
Yeah, Salima was wearing a hard hat and a mask to keep from breathing in the bad air. She eased into the chamber on her stomach, careful not to damage the mummies.
So I was wiggling like a worm in through this entirely dark, unexplored series of chambers filled with animal mummies and trying to make a drawing of the tomb. And I've just got a flashlight, a torch with me, trying to see into the corners and things.
Okay, so she's wiggling, drawing, and exploring all at the same time, which sounds to me like an awful lot of multitasking.
I feel like you'll be just running on sheer adrenaline.
Yeah, surrounded by mummies.
You never know what you're going to see next. And when you put your hand down, what it's going to touch.
I didn't even think that that's what exploring a tomb would feel like.
And I didn't think about what it would smell like.
And it's very smelly. Even with my mask, it was smelly.
So what does it smell like?
Smells like mummies. And you just have to know what a mummy smells like, because there isn't anything else that's quite like it. So it smells a bit of resins and a bit of decomposing flesh and a bit of other spices.
Once you've smelled mummy, it's a smell you can't forget, and it sticks with you.
I guess that's the real curse of the mummy right there.
You know, you'll be a week later and suddenly you'll smell mummy when you're in the supermarket. And it's really unnerving because you look around going, what? Where?
Is she sure that there wasn't a mummy following her to the grocery store, being like, can you get some tomatoes?
Salima might actually be excited to see that because she loves to meet new mummies.
Well, when you go into a tomb that's not really been explored, it's exciting. You want to see what's there next. And if you think they're going to be a bunch of mummies, I suppose it's like going to a party where you don't know that many people. And they're just potential friends.
That's an interesting viewpoint, both for mummy finding and parties.
Well, you should prepare to meet some new mummy animal friends right after this. When you think of a mummy, you might imagine King Tutankhamun, the Egyptian boy king whose tomb was excavated 100 years ago. King Tut's body was wrapped in linen cloth, packed with luxuries for the afterlife, and enclosed within a solid gold coffin.
I guess if you have to be enclosed in a coffin, it might as well be solid gold and full of luxuries.
Not every mummy got a solid gold coffin, because it wasn't just kings and queens or even regular people who were mummified. Animals became mummies too, and Salima is an expert in animal mummies.
We excavated a dog catacomb. We don't know how long it was active, whether it was 200 years or 100 years, but we have about 8 million dog mummies there. 8 million.
Wait, 8 million dog mummies? That's like a lot of dog mummies.
Yes, that's almost as many dog mummies as there are people who live in New York City right now.
But how do you get that many dogs? Because even just putting them in there, I feel like that would take a long time.
That would be all the work you'll be willing to do with the dog mummies.
Okay,
I don't want to make up
400,000, 400,001, 400,002, 400,003.
I want to know how the archaeologists counted them. But what Salima's focus is how and why so many animals were mummified in the first place.
This is it. One of the things that interests us is how did they get the animals? Because, your pet dog or cat, fine. But when you have them in the millions, we have to try and figure out how many years, how many per year, what was going on.
Well, mummification must have been a really huge operation. You'd have to be working around the clock to mummify that many dogs. And where did they all come from?
How were they bred? How did they get so many cats and dogs and ibises? So getting the animals, and also there must have been amazing trade routes into Africa to get the baboons.
Wait, there were baboon mummies? Baboons don't live in Egypt, do they?
They don't.
They have green monkeys and baboons that were brought in and were mummified. And also some of them came in as pets. So you've got pet mummies that were baboons.
Okay, so there's crazy exotic pets and crazy numbers of animal mummies, and this just keeps going deeper. So I'm with Salima. What was going on?
And that's what we're going to investigate.
Being an archaeologist is a bit like being a detective.
So Salima starts by gathering all the clues she can. First, using the tools of science.
You try and figure things out forensically. So by looking at the mummy itself, by doing x-rays of it, CT scans, chemically testing the materials that were used to make the mummy, you can sort of figure out how the mummy was made.
So wait, we don't know how mummies were made? I thought we did.
Well, we have the basics thanks to a Greek historian named Herodotus, who visited ancient Egypt while mummification was a common practice.
And he wrote a book about what he learned about Egypt, and he talks about mummification. So using the notes that he made, what little we have from the ancient Egyptian texts, and then you look at the mummies themselves to try and figure out how mummification was carried out.
According to Herodotus, Egyptians removed the mushy organs like the brain and intestines and dried out the body over a long period of time.
Ugh.
Human beings and animals are mainly water. So if you get rid of the water and some of the fat, then you've got a lovely shell of yourself. And then you are a beautiful mummy that can be wrapped up and then buried.
She really makes it sound like a lovely afternoon craft project. Like, let's make some paper airplanes, a lanyard, or, we can mummify something.
Well, get out your newspaper and lay it down on the table because this is going to be a messy project.
No kidding.
Salima found this out for herself when she and her team decided to do some animal mummy experimentation.
Wait, I'm assuming the mummies to be all died of natural causes?
Yes, they did, and they were donated for mummy science.
We did different tests. One rabbit was left to dry, and it bloated up with gases and sort of exploded, and it was not really a pretty sight.
Oh, geez. That's not good.
Well, that's why Egyptians did mummification in the first place. They believed people and animals needed their bodies in the afterlife. So they literally had to stay in shape. The Egyptians cut down on gas buildup by removing the organs after death. And so that's what Salima and her team did with a second rabbit.
And then following Herodotus, we washed it out, we dried it.
Herodotus, the Greek historian, had mentioned a substance that's basically salt and baking soda. So Salima took this and filled up little packets of cloth, stuffed them into the body, waited, and finally they had a very dry bunny mummy.
Well, it's a good thing she followed Herodotus's How to Make a Mummy in 5 Minutes tutorial.
The next question was how to get your mummy to strike the perfect pose.
Right.
Salima knew that the animals were somehow set up to look as if they were still alive.
Cats and dogs were positioned as if they were sitting up with their tails pulled through and tucked along their bellies. And snakes were put into a little spiral often.
That's more than a little creepy, but how did they do that?
Well, the mummies were really dry, but they had to loosen them up again. Salima experimented using oil.
It's tricky because how much oil do you use after you've dried it? Because you don't want to overly rehydrate, but you do need to have it be a bit flexible so you can position the animal or human being into the right pose.
If a mummy wasn't flexible enough, it could crack.
It's like, oh no, you broke the pharaoh. Put him back, put him back.
There were not hot glue guns back then, I'll tell you.
I wonder what they did.
Now for the most famous mummification process, the wrapping. The Egyptians used linen ripped into bandages. Then everything was coated in resin to seal.
What's resin?
Resins are a natural glue like beeswax or tree sap. But Salima didn't know what exactly they were using, so she ran experiments with machines that could identify the chemistry of each mummy.
That's the fun of this job, is you get to play with these machines that I don't understand, and you get to take samples and whiz them up, and then suddenly you're like, I can see that it's got this and this and this in it, and then you're like looking at a library to match what those three things would mean, that it's resin or beeswax. It's like magic.
Okay, so we've got a basic mummy here. Now what?
Well, each type of animal has its own mummification challenge.
Crocodiles are surprisingly easy, even though they're very big. Cows. They have 4 stomachs. Oh my God. Can you imagine removing those stomachs? Very difficult.
Yeah, no, I can't imagine even wanting to do that.
I don't think it's about want as much as need to.
I guess. If someone was like, can you get all these stomachs out of this cow? And I'd be like, well, I guess.
Another thing is that not all mummies were a single body. Salima told me about one surprise mummy that looked like the head of a sacred bird called an ibis.
And when it was x-rayed, there were lots and lots of ibis mummies in separate packages in that whole thing. But it was wrapped up to look like a big mega ibis. It was very weird. So there are all kinds of really curious things.
Wait, so they just packed a bunch of bird mummies into a bird-shaped package? Besides being like a super fun craft project, why would they do that?
Well, that's the next step in archaeological detective work. You use the tools of science, but then you have to study the culture that created them to figure out why this happened.
And then you have to look at places where the mummies have been buried and what you find around them. And that might tell you about the religious ideas that made people do this. Why were they doing these things? What did it mean for an ancient Egyptian to give a mummy as an offering, a mummified animal?
Wait, an offering of a mummified animal? What does that mean?
Good question. Egyptologists have studied pictures and writing on tomb and temple walls that described the religious beliefs of ancient Egypt, and that told them about offerings to the gods.
There were animals that the Egyptians believed were sacred to a particular god. And they believed that the god, when the god wanted, could enter the body of the animal and sort of be there amongst living people.
Huh, so like a dog could be like the living form of a god.
Yeah, each god or goddess had an animal that went along with it.
So cats, for example, were sacred to the goddess Bastet, who is the goddess of motherhood and love and beauty and sort of self-indulgence and a variety of other things.
Egyptians who wanted help from Bastet could give her a gift or an offering. A mummified cat was the greatest gift that you could give.
And often the Egyptians must have thought that because the cat had been a living creature, it was more powerful than anything made of wood or stone or metal.
So lots of people would have wanted to make the most powerful offering to the gods that they could, and that's probably why they made so many animal mummies.
Animal mummification was definitely a serious business. And each finding of a tomb or strange mummy gives archaeologists a little bit more to go on.
We come up with ideas as to why the Egyptians did what they did, what they were thinking, what particular aspect of their life or culture or belief something was a manifestation of.
Okay, well, so now can we say that we know how and why there were so many animal mummies?
I think it's very difficult to say, yes, we know, ever, because there are more than 3,000 years between us, and we don't have the whole picture. It's like you're doing a puzzle where half the pieces are missing and you don't know what the picture is on the box.
But are there more puzzle pieces left to find? I mean, like more mummies, tombs, and maybe some powerful magical amulets that can give powers?
Apart from the amulets, I'm sure that there are.
Oh, there is about 70% at least still left to discover. I mean, some of it's going to be hard to get to because people are living on top of it. But there are also large parts of the desert which contain tombs that have yet to be found, but there's still a lot more potential.
All right, that's all I needed to hear. Let's book our tickets to Cairo. I've got a shovel somewhere. I'll go put it in a bag.
I feel like with that plan, we might end up as mummies ourselves.
Now that you've explored the incredible diversity of animal mummies, it's time to make your own. Oh, I hope not.
Don't worry, Marshall. We're not going to ask our listeners to actually mummify anything. Just draw an animal mummy.
Oh, wow, that sounds a lot cleaner.
All you'll need is paper and something to draw or color with. Some animal mummies had faces painted onto them or were wrapped up in beautifully woven cloth patterns. So get creative.
And send us your drawings when you're done. We'd really love to see them.
Thanks to Dr. Salima Ikram, Distinguished University Professor at the American University in Cairo, Egypt. I have to say, that was one of the most fun interviews I've ever done. You can see photos of animal mummies on the blog on our website, sciencepodcastforkids.com.
Interestingly, our next story also has to do with keeping something preserved, but this time, instead of dead animals, it's vegetables.
This story got its start with a question from a kid who wondered why good pumpkins go bad once you carve them. So here comes the jack-o'-lantern science mystery. Hi, I'm Lindsay.
And I'm Marshall. Welcome to Tumble, the show where we explore stories of science discovery.
It's a special Halloween episode, and this year we're tackling some pumpkin-spiced science.
Ooh, are we talking about seasonal squash?
Yes, we're solving the mystery of why jack-o'-lanterns perish into a sad, squishy mess every year. We'll crack the case and discover how to make a pumpkin last forever.
Right after this.
Our Halloween science question comes from our fellow kid podcaster, Ari.
I'm Ari, the host of At Your Level, a podcast for kids by kids. And my Halloween-flavored science question is why? Oh, but why does a pumpkin I carve rot so much faster than an uncarved pumpkin? Now, I'm assuming that's even the case. And if it is, I think it's because the air gets into the pumpkin faster, which makes it rot faster. I'm not 100% sure. What do you think? And I'm 11, by the way. Thanks, and happy Halloween.
That's a good question. It is a bit ironic that jack-o'-lanterns look their scariest, like several weeks after Halloween.
Yes, they get soft and then they shrink, and soon they're on full-on rot mode.
Just a little puddle of grossness.
You have to get them off your porch or out of your windowsill before they just completely fall apart.
But if you put a festive non-carved pumpkin on that same porch or windowsill, it'll last seemingly forever.
So let's join Ari in asking our listeners what they think. Do jack-o'-lanterns rot faster than uncarved pumpkins? And if so, why?
We'll give you a moment to think about it before we return to solve a squash mystery.
When I heard Ari's question, I knew we needed a detective who could get inside the head of a jack-o'-lantern. And I found just the right person.
I'm Michael Mazurik. I'm a vegetable breeder here at Cornell University.
A vegetable breeder? Like, that doesn't have detective in the job description.
You're right. Vegetable breeders are responsible for creating new varieties of vegetables. But where the detectiveness comes in is that Michael's specialty is pumpkin and other types of squash.
Yep, squash, pumpkin, and some other vegetables as well, but lots of squash and pumpkin for sure. And 'tis the season.
'Tis the season to breed pumpkin. Da la 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 la.
Michael was actually taking a break from the fall harvest when I talked to him.
So he's literally a scientist farmer.
Yes, and come Halloween time, that combination results in some pretty interesting jack-o'-lanterns appearing in the lab.
I have one student with me here at Cornell. She's been carving jack-o'-lanterns and has started to put them in the freeze dryer.
So freeze-dried pumpkin, does that make them look like little shriveled, shrunken heads, like from a horror show?
It looks like it's mummified, without the wrapping.
Halloween is definitely a special time in the squash lab.
This is using science to celebrate the season.
Well, okay. So now that we know that Michael is qualified to help on our case, what's the first step?
Well, like any good squash detective, we begin by using our powers of observation to find clues. Michael pointed us towards our first.
Sometimes you have a fruit that doesn't last very long at all. If you leave your raspberries out on the counter, they will start to dry out. And if it's a little slow, they'll also get the fuzziness, the gray fuzz.
Huh. Yeah, I've observed that too. Sometimes you barely have time to eat raspberries before they get all like mushy and moldy. But what does that have to do with pumpkins?
Use your powers of deduction. What keeps a pumpkin from getting dry and fuzzy?
Probably the orange part. It's orange, and that's it, yeah.
Let's see what Michael says.
Pumpkins are a type of fruit that usually lasts longer because they have kind of a multi-layered coating.
I was right. The pumpkin is coated in orange, and it's the orange.
Well, maybe it's not just the color on its own.
I don't know. Seems pretty open and shut case here.
So the skin, the orange part of the pumpkin, has a wax to it.
Wait, so it's the wax? I guess that's why we don't eat the skin of a pumpkin. It's like all waxy.
You can also feel it when you rub the pumpkin with your finger, and that layer of wax keeps moisture out and in.
And so that wax is protective, and that's what's sealing in the water. And I think that's what Ari's noticing. Once he pops a hole in that, then all the moisture can leak back out all the holes.
Okay, I get it now. So the pumpkin can dry out like a raspberry if there's a hole in its protective covering.
Yes, all fruits hold water inside of them. It's what they need to grow and stay plump and juicy.
Oh yeah, because when you get dried fruits, they're all like wrinkly and chewy.
Exactly.
All right, it seems like we're getting somewhere here.
Next, Michael turned his attention to the weapon, the knife.
If you have one of those little pumpkin carver knives that has like the little serrated wavy teeth, you can hear it as it cuts through the skin. Rump, rump.
I knew it. It was the knife. I had it here on my clue card.
Yes, the knife is involved, but that's not our mystery.
Oh, okay. Well, go on.
Well, if you've ever bought a pumpkin carving kit, it includes a knife with sharp teeth.
That is going through a tough tissue.
No, so he's talking about that like thick part that's under the orangey rind. It's like the pumpkin lining.
Or the defensive walls guarding the pumpkin castle.
So it can be really hard, and that's a good barrier to keep out all of the bacteria and fungus that would colonize it.
Wait, so what does that mean? Like bacteria and fungus would colonize it?
Big multiplying groups of bacteria and mold are called colonies. That's what you see making raspberries get fuzzy and gross.
Where do those colonizing bacteria and mold come from?
Well, remember how Ari suspected the air is what's rotting the jack-o'-lantern?
In the air is bacteria and mold spores, and their job is to break things down. And that's how trees run compost and everything turns back into soil when it like falls on the ground.
Oh my gosh, this goes so much deeper than we thought. Rotting is everywhere.
Yeah, it's called decomposition. It affects every living thing on the planet, and it also keeps our planet growing.
Oh my gosh, so is this what happened to the oranges in our fruit bowl too? All the dots are getting connected.
But let's not lose focus. We're still on the pumpkin. We're not through the pumpkin yet, because there's one final hidden layer.
A hidden layer? What could that be?
Yes, a hidden layer, so well hidden, Michael says we actually have to look for it on a different kind of squash.
It's easiest, I think, to see on a butternut squash.
He says if you peel a butternut squash, the third layer will appear right before your eyes.
It will start to make a latex, a sap.
Wait, a squash makes sap like a pine tree does? Like that sticky stuff? And that's the final layer?
Yes.
And then if you touch it and then rub your fingers and let it dry, they'll stick together.
I've touched this layer many times without realizing what it was, but it's the reason why I now avoid peeling butternut squash.
Well, then I'd say it works pretty well if it's keeping you away.
I just buy it pre-cut now. Anyhow, the sap is meant to protect the squash if an insect or animal took a bite out of it.
It could grow its own Band-Aid with this latex, sap.
Wait, so a squash can make itself a Band-Aid? That's amazing. Like, oh, all better. Little bug bite, no big deal.
It's kind of crazy, but it's also no match for a carving knife.
And so the problem for the pumpkin is once you cut into it, you're making big holes in the place it would normally patch over with its sap.
Oh, I see. Things are really beginning to add up.
Now you've taken out all three layers. You've taken out the wax, you've taken out the woody cell wall barrier, and you've also taken out its chemical defense of that sap.
Okay, I feel like we're at the point in the story where the detective just is putting everything together. This is going to be good. Should I get popcorn?
So by breaching all three, yes, it starts to leak air and water vapor will dry out from the inside for sure. And any bacteria that land in or mold, you'll start to see it as black and blue polka dots. And then, you'll need to get it off the porch while you can still pick it up. When you pick it up and your fingers go through, you've waited too long.
Oh, it's so satisfying. It was the knife in the pumpkin at Halloween.
Yes, After the knife carved the pumpkin, a natural process began. The pumpkin started to dry out and bacteria and mold landed inside of it. That meant it decomposed much faster than a pumpkin with all of its protective layers still intact.
Case closed. So there's just one thing that's bugging me about this case.
What's that?
Is there some way that we can, save jack-o'-lanterns or keep them from having to rot in the first place?
How? What do you mean?
Well, what if we could save jack-o'-lanterns by, making them into pie before they decompose, and then instead of decomposing, they just get eaten?
That's an interesting idea. It depends on what kind of pumpkin you're using. So I asked Michael about different kinds of pumpkins.
So that is a great question. That is one that most people never get to the bottom to ever.
Wow, we're tapping into some deep pumpkin mysteries here.
Michael said that there's 3 species of pumpkins and a huge number of varieties.
There's the orange jack-o'-lanterns that you can make a pie out of, but it won't be a very good one.
I actually did try to do this once, and so I know Michael is right. They're really stringy and watery when baked and not good for pie. The big pumpkin patch pumpkins are really meant for carving.
So it's just their destiny to have a weird face on them. It's like an unusual destiny for a vegetable.
Yes, and this is the biggest pumpkin surprise. The puree you find in the pumpkin can isn't from a pumpkin at all.
That is actually a pumpkin-shaped butternut squash. They make that out of.
Hold on, what? I've been deceived my whole life.
They're called Dickinson pumpkins, and they're pale orange and oval-shaped. While they're called pumpkins, they're more closely related to a butternut squash than your jack-o'-lantern.
Most people would never know that about their pumpkin pies.
I'll never look at a can of pumpkin pie filling the same way again.
I'll never be able to not tell somebody this.
Okay, so maybe we shouldn't upcycle our jack-o'-lanterns into pie, but there's got to be some way that we can save a jack-o'-lantern.
I think I might have an idea.
What is it?
Well, before you can carve a jack-o'-lantern, you have to scoop out the seeds.
Right, and your hands get all gooey, and then you either roast them or, throw them in the compost.
Stop right there. There's a third thing you can do with seeds.
What?
Save them.
Save them for what?
So you can plant them and grow new jack-o'-lanterns from your old jack-o'-lantern.
Ah, the circle of life. It just continues forever.
Exactly. Pumpkins are actually meant to decompose so that they give nutrients back to the soil, and new seeds from inside the jack-o'-lantern can grow and thrive in the old one.
And one jack-o'-lantern can make so many more jack-o'-lanterns. But how did you know this?
Well, I got a tip from a squash detective/scientist.
If you pop open a pumpkin seed, you'll see that it has these 2 halves. Those are the first leaves, the cotyledons that are going to pop out of the ground.
Wow, so the baby jack-o'-lantern seedlings are already in your pumpkin. It's like a pumpkin patch starter kit.
Yes, and all you need to do is dry out the seeds for a week or so until one snaps when you bend it. Then you save them during the winter in a cool, dry place like your fridge.
Then you can plant the seeds for many more future pumpkin mysteries. Try it out. Save your seeds and plant a pumpkin patch.
Or if you're not in a space where you can garden, try popping open a pumpkin seed like Michael suggested. Can you see the cotyledons? Every plant seed has these tiny first leaves hiding inside.
There's lots of discoveries to make in vegetable seeds and gardens. Take photos of your jack-o'-lanterns and pumpkin patches, then send them to us at tumblepodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to see them.
Thanks to Dr. Michael Mazurek, Associate Professor in the School of Integrative Plant Science at Cornell University. Michael is also the plant breeder responsible for the smash hit squash, the honey nut squash.
I like the idea of a smash hit squash. Does it get like thousands of streams on Spotify?
It's the hottest item at the farmers markets now. And when I saw it for the first time at our local farm, I was like, I know that guy.
I know the guy who made the honey nut squash.
I felt like I had been next to greatness. And it's delicious.
He's still one of my favorite all-time guests. So cheerful and so into squash.
I have to say, I thought about the story a lot when we carved jack-o'-lanterns this year. And anytime I see squash, I think about how good they are at not rotting.
It's a good thing to be good at if you're a vegetable. I have to say, though, I've already seen a few rotting jack-o'-lanterns. It's not even Halloween yet.
And we all know the sad science behind it. So if you're just tuning in and wondering who we are and what we're doing on NEPM, this is the Tumble Science Podcast for Kids. I'm Lindsay.
I'm Marshall.
And this is our Halloween Science Extravaganza. So not all of our episodes are Halloween themed, obviously, with our spooky Halloween themed song. We have episodes that cover nearly every field of science, and you can listen to them all for free whenever you want on all the major podcast players, including Apple and Spotify.
When you follow or subscribe to Tumble Science Podcast for Kids, you'll find episodes that tackle the biggest questions in science, like do trees fart? And do bugs have elbows?
These are the questions that matter.
Believe it or not, they are.
They do. We love to cover topics like space, dinosaur, and gross science. In fact, our next episode is about how toilets work.
We also get a lot of great questions from kids, and you can write to us at tumblepodcast@gmail.com to ask your science questions.
All you need to do is search for Tumble Science Podcast for Kids on your podcast app to follow or subscribe to our feed, or just find us on our website at sciencepodcastforkids.com.
Sometimes we do events in the community, too. I, personally, was just at Kids Day with NEPM, collecting kids' questions for our podcast.
And we also have a very cool band called the Sometimes Butts that join us for some live events.
You'll have to listen to our episode, The Science of Butts, to find out why they're called that.
You'll also find out a lot about butts. We're going to take a quick break for local news before we're back with our final Halloween story. It's a math mystery that starts with a sweet treat, so stay tuned. Tumble's Halloween Science Extravaganza is back for our final Halloween science story, and it's about the true meaning of Halloween, candy.
What's the true meaning of candy? Isn't it just like you eat enough to rot your teeth and maybe throw up?
I think we've established candy is delicious, but it's also scientific. Or should I say it's mathematic? Because this story is told by a candy-loving mathematician who makes candy in his lab, and he keeps discovering that they're turning into dagger shapes.
What? That's a real whodunit.
We'll find out how this candy dagger can help us understand a mysterious landscape in the science of Candyland. Hi, I'm Lindsay.
And I'm Marshall. Welcome to Tumble, the show where we explore stories of science discovery.
Today, we're going to Candyland, a place where mathematicians cook up sugary confections.
Did you say mathematicians are making candy? Why?
Well, the math behind candy can teach us a lot about the landscape around us. We'll find out how a sweet-toothed mathematician stumbled into making sweet experiments.
Well, let's find out if this story is a trick or a treat.
Today, Leif Rystroff is a professor of mathematics. But many years ago, he was just a kid trying to keep his Halloween candy safe.
I would always have a candy box that I would store all my candy in, and I would hide it away from my brothers and sisters. And so on Halloween, I would go and crack open the candy box and restock it up and then go and hide it away somewhere.
Yeah, I definitely relate to that. I had two sisters, so I always had to eat my Halloween candy really fast until I realized I was the only one who was eating it.
I would hide my candy from my parents and my brother under my bed in a pillowcase, which I consider the perfect bag for a big candy haul. But Leaf's candy box has really lasted him a long time.
In lab now, we make use of the candy box idea.
Leaf runs an experimental math lab, which means that rather than just using numbers, he actually does physical experiments. And he's experimenting with candy.
And why does he keep them in a box?
To keep his experiments from getting ruined.
We have had a few infestations of ants in our lab. If you leave out your samples for too long, you will find many little crawlies in your experiment.
That's probably a problem that a lot of his mathematician colleagues don't have, that if they leave their work out for too long, it starts to attract bugs.
Well, after finding ants feasting on his experiments, Leaf brought the Halloween candy box back into year-round use.
So tell me, how does a mathematician end up doing experiments with candy?
That's a question I desperately wanted the answer to. So I asked Leaf.
So, yeah, why do we have candy in the lab? We're interested in how landscapes take on their shapes. Where do their interesting shapes come from?
Wait. So he's saying that he studies landscapes like mountains and big dramatic rock formations by using candy, like a literal candy land.
That's right. We're in a Candyland lab.
Haha.
We call it our candy landscapes.
That's so delightful, but I really don't get it. Do they just like mold the candy into the shape of like an ocean and the Rocky Mountains and like decorate it with gumdrops and cotton candy and like put little gnomes in it?
No, they're actually molding the candy into normal shapes, just like circles or spheres, rectangles, and cylinders. And then they put it in water to dissolve.
And to dissolve, like how sugar dissolves into coffee or tea?
Exactly. It turns out that some of the most mysterious and unusual rock formations on the planet formed by dissolving into water over many, many years.
In this case, we wanted to see how these landforms evolved. And so we needed what I call a mock rock. That is a mineral that can dissolve, but not so slow like a natural mineral would.
So a mock rock? Do they build the mock rocks into blocks and then they have a mock rock block?
Mock rock is like fake rock.
Aha.
Mock rock. The reason he needs a mock rock is to press fast forward on landscapes that would naturally take thousands of years to take shape.
So you really need to turn forward the mock rock clock.
What we have honed in on to study as our mock rock is what you would call hard candy.
If you've ever had a Jolly Rancher, another like little square hard candy, you felt with your tongue how the candy takes different shapes as it gets smaller.
Yeah, Jolly Ranchers, like they kind of flatten out into panes of candy glass, but lollipops stay rounder.
And lollipops were the first mock rock structure that Leaf studied.
We studied basically how a lollipop, a sphere of candy, changes shape when you put it in a flow.
What does that mean, put it in a flow?
Think of a round rock sitting in a river or a lollipop in a salivating mouth.
And we used that to answer the age-old question, how many licks does it take to get to the center of a lollipop?
You know, this is something I've been wanting to know since I was a kid in the 80s watching that Tootsie Pop commercial.
Exactly. The owl said it was about 3 licks.
Well, technically it was 2 licks and then a bite. It really wasn't a scientific method he was employing.
I know. I really never trusted that owl.
It's good to know that some professionals are actually trying to do a rigorous study.
Leaf's study was actually about how rivers might erode or dissolve the land around them, but he used a mathematical formula to apply his findings to licks.
So what was the real, empirically tested scientific answer?
So, yeah, somewhere around 1,000.
I'm going to have to fact check that, and I'm going to go get a Tootsie Pop right now.
Well, Leaf doesn't use Tootsie Pops or any other brand of candy in his lab. He actually makes his own.
We also kind of perfected a procedure for how to make bubble-free candy. And this is actually really important. So when you're enjoying a lollipop, you might notice that there's typically embedded within the candy a bubble or two, maybe lots of them.
Oh, I know what he's talking about. So you're sucking on the candy and you kind of hit a hole with your tongue, which is a candy cave.
Through a lot of sugar and I imagine sweat and stirring, the lab nailed the recipe for bubble-free, research-grade candy.
So we can control the quality of the material, and we can also make it into any shape we want, which is very, very convenient.
Basically, the procedure is that they boil the ingredients together and pour it into a mold to harden.
Does anyone sneak candy? Has anyone seen my experiment? Hey, Reinhold, what's in your mouth?
Well, the downside of mathematicians being the ones making candy is that they're not really concerned about taste.
But the thing is, we didn't really have any nice flavors or anything, so it was basically just sugar.
I feel like if they tried just a little harder, they could be like science's Willy Wonka factory. It could be Willy Wonka's research grade candy.
They're really just one logical step away.
Just add a chocolate river running through the lab and then take its temperature every so often and put it in a spreadsheet. Voila! Science!
Well, at the candy lab, wacky things are already happening. One day, Leaf and his team forgot about a candy cylinder that they'd left sitting in a tub of water.
I think we had other plans for it, and then we stepped away, and it actually only takes about an hour or so.
It only takes an hour or so for what?
For the candy to dissolve into a surprising shape.
And what wasn't, before a nice, smooth object now has been carved into this spike like a dagger.
A candy dagger? Dum, dum, dum!
Yeah, it was like a cone at the bottom, thinning out into a sharp point on top. A student working in the lab was the first one to notice it.
And it was so sharp and so fine that he couldn't resist kind of getting his hand down in the tank and maybe touching it just to see it, how sharp is it? And he did that and actually pricked his finger, cut himself on the thing.
Wow, I never knew candy could be so dangerous.
The student was fine, but the fact that the tip was so incredibly thin and sharp caught Leaf's attention. They repeated what had happened first by accident, leaving the candy in the water. And every time, the candy made a spike.
What's interesting is, once it kind of first makes this pointy shape, it then keeps it. It really, really likes to be that shape. And what happens then is it sort of shrinks in size, so it gets smaller and smaller and smaller.
No matter how small it gets, it stays a spike until it completely disappears.
And that happened every time with every experiment?
Yes. In fact, no matter what kind of shape you start with, if you dissolve it in water, you'll get a spike.
That's so weird. So how did Leaf find out why candy wants to be a spike?
First, his team recreated the dissolving candy with math. They made a mathematical model to figure out the rules behind what was happening. The model works kind of like a video game, and it let them play around with their ideas of what caused the candy to become a spike.
So it's kind of like Mathy Candy Crush.
Right. They took a closer look at the real candy next. They suspected that something was happening with the water that they couldn't see.
So we had to play lots of the tricks that we play to make the flow of the water visible.
Using a strong laser light, Leaf could watch how tiny particles moved through the water. He saw how the water, the candy, and gravity interacted.
The candy molecules that were in the solid, they jump into the fluid.
So that's literally the process of something dissolving.
Right, and then gravity pulls the candy molecules down the side of the shape.
And they're heavy. They're heavier than the water around them. So they start to fall and drag all the liquid with it. So they drag the water down.
Oh, so it's kind of like an avalanche flowing down a mountain.
Yeah, but instead of the molecules tumbling down just once, they're continually falling and dragging the water with it.
And the tendency that we kind of discovered and then explained, at least mathematically, is that these flows tend to make the object into a spike, regardless of how you started out the thing.
It's so simple, but it makes so much sense. When things dissolve, they're being washed away, and that reshapes them.
Yes, and then remember, the whole reason for studying candy in the first place is because it can show us how rock dissolves.
Right, the mock rock.
So after we were making these candy spikes, we were like, hey, if this thing is making a spike no matter what, then this has got to show up in nature.
Meaning there should be sharp, spiky rocks somewhere.
Yeah, and there are. They're called stone forests.
Oh, that sounds so hardcore. What does a stone forest look like?
So you should think of rock that is, maybe even as tall as some buildings. There are sharp spikes pointed upwards, and there's many, many, many of them. So that's how they get the name of a forest.
Leif's favorite stone forest is in Madagascar. I'm going to show you a picture right now.
Whoa, that is so cool. It's like walking amongst, I don't even know what. It literally looks like trees, just like stretching out, but they're definitely rocks.
Yeah, and there are a few ideas out there as to how these stone forests might have formed through like a complicated history of geologic events, like this thing happening, then that thing happening. But Leif's candy hypothesis is much simpler.
Maybe there doesn't need to be some kind of intricate sequence of events to make a stone forest. Maybe the tendency to make a spiky kind of shape is the natural one.
I have to say, I really love how this fun candy math experiment could help solve a real mystery in the real world.
There's really so much going on in Leif's lab. You got candy, math, physics, geology, but Leif says that the most important part is curiosity.
Science, you may get the impression that it's about getting the numbers right, and it so is. Like we care about that a lot. But I think there's this childlike wonder, this curiosity that you should have, and you should work super hard to maintain as long as possible. Hopefully your whole life.
Do you want to do your own candy science? Leif's experiment can be done at home.
We have Leif's recipe for research-grade candy on our website. We'll say that the trick to bubble-free candy is to cool it very slowly in the mold so that all the bubbles rise up to the top and pop.
If you don't want to make your own candy, we had fun throwing store-bought hard candy in water and making observations about how it dissolved. How long it took, what it looked like, and what it smelled like. I see here that we've put down that it smelled like watermelon.
As you observe your dissolving candy, come up with your own ideas or hypotheses for what's happening and why. Thanks to Dr. Leif Riestroff, Assistant Professor of Mathematics at New York University.
Wonder if Leif's lab throws a Halloween party every year with their homemade candy.
And colorful leaves?
That would be super fun.
I feel like it's a missed opportunity if they don't do it.
Well, this just about does it for the Tumble Science Podcast for Kids Halloween Science Extravaganza.
Thank you so much for joining us. We have had such a good time being here on NEPM and sharing our Halloween podcast episodes with you over the radio airwaves. But there's so much more science for you on our podcast.
We have over 120 episodes on our podcast feed that you can access wherever you get your podcasts. We got episodes about snot, about hungry koalas, about outer space, dinosaurs, really any science topic that you're interested in. We've probably covered it at least once.
There's always more questions to answer, and we've got a ton of exciting topics coming up on Season 8 of Tumble Science Podcast for Kids, so make sure to follow us. And if you speak Spanish, we've got a series called Tumble en Español that's adaptations of some of our favorite Tumble episodes ever.
You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, wherever you do your social media too.
Thanks so much to NEPM for having us. Again, I'm Lindsay.
And I'm Marshall, and we've been the Tumble Science Podcast for Kids. Go find us wherever you get your podcasts for more stories of science discovery.